The night had fallen heavy on the prairie, with only the distant call of coyotes and the low whistle of wind weaving through the cracks of old wooden boards. In the flickering glow of a lantern, the air smelled of smoke, dust, and sorrow. The farmhouse stood like a weary sentinel on the edge of nowhere, its walls carrying the weight of seasons gone and secrets buried. Inside, the silence was not peaceful but tense, filled with a kind of waiting that gnawed at the bones. Folks in town whispered about the place, about the young widow who lived there after her husband's sudden passing. They said her laughter had died with him, replaced by long shadows and a gaze that looked past you, as though she saw something you could not. The farm had once thrived under strong hands and steady toil, but now the fences sagged and the fields went untended. Neighbors passed by on their wagons, some curious, some fearful, each casting a glance toward the porch where she sometimes stood. A woman too young to wear grief like a shroud, yet bound to it by circumstance. She was not seen often at church anymore, not at the gatherings where hymns carried across the hills. Instead, she kept to herself, hidden in that dim farmhouse where only the lantern burned through the night. And when strangers asked about her, old-timers shook their heads. "Best not to stir up talk," they'd mutter. Some things don't take kindly to daylight, but out on the trail, life has a way of crossing paths where it shouldn't. One evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, a lone rider approached the valley. His hat brim was low, dust caked his boots, and his horse carried the look of miles too many behind it. He wasn't a man tied to any place or anyone, just a wandering cowboy with the road as his only companion. Folks like him had no roots, only stories told around fires and memories carried in silence. Yet, sometimes fate has its own designs, pulling one soul toward another when least expected. He caught sight of the farmhouse as the last light faded. Something about the way smoke curled from its chimney, faint and thin, made him pause. There was a heaviness about that place, like a tune played too slowly, notes stretched until they threatened to break. He thought to ride on, for a man with no ties should have no business in the affairs of strangers. But something unseen, call it instinct or destiny, made him turn his horse toward the worn path that led to her door inside. She sat near the lamp, her hands trembling as she clutched a shawl around her shoulders. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the groan of wood and the distant cry of night creatures. She felt trapped in her own home, a prisoner not of walls but of fear that never seemed to loosen its grip. Since her husband's death, she had been left vulnerable in a land where danger traveled freely. Bandits and drifters sometimes roamed the hills, and whispers of outlaws were not uncommon. She knew the risks of being alone, yet no kin came to stay, and no neighbor dared cross the threshold after dark. The cowboy dismounted, boots crunching on the dirt, and knocked once against the door. His voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of miles. "Ma'am, I mean no harm. Just a man needing water for his horse and a place to rest a spell." His words hung in the air, met with silence. Inside she froze. Trust was a fragile thing, and out here it could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Her breath caught, torn between caution and the ache of loneliness that had grown too heavy to bear at last. The latch gave way, and the door creaked open. Lantern light spilled across his weathered face, shadowing his eyes yet revealing a quiet resolve. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room, noting the disrepair, the unease that clung to every corner. She stood before him, a figure caught between strength and fragility, her voice barely more than a whisper when she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." He tipped his hat, respectful, though his presence filled the room with something unfamiliar, safety or maybe danger in disguise. "Sometimes the trail don't give a man a choice," he replied. What he didn't know was that she was not simply a widow holding to grief. Something darker had taken hold of her days and nights. More than loneliness haunted these walls. There had been footsteps outside, doors rattling when no wind blew, and once, the unmistakable scrape of a chair moving though no hand touched it. She feared not only the living, but something else, something that seemed intent on binding her to silence. As the cowboy set his gear down and the lantern flickered against the old timbers, the air seemed to tighten. A sudden creak came from the far room, sharp enough to still his breath. He turned, hand brushing against the holster at his side, while she stepped back, her eyes wide with the look of someone who had lived too long with unseen threats. The farmhouse groaned again, though no step followed. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and for a moment the cowboy felt as though the very house was watching. He glanced at her, then at the rope coiled neatly on a shelf, the way her hands trembled as though she remembered its touch. Something about her silence carried a plea, one she could not voice, yet one he could not ignore. Outside, the coyotes wailed again, sharper this time, like a warning echoing across the land. Inside, the lantern flickered, threatening to go out. The cowboy knew he had stumbled into more than just a place to rest. There was a story here, one hidden in shadows and silence, one that had already begun to bind him tighter than he expected. He took a slow breath, eyes fixed on the door that had creaked though no one entered, and the widow's gaze never left him. In that silence, he felt the weight of a decision pressing against him. To turn back would be the safer path, to ride into the night and leave her to whatever fate lingered here. But another choice stirred, a dangerous one, perhaps foolish, yet impossible to ignore. The lantern sputtered, casting them in sudden darkness before it flared back to life. In that brief moment, he thought he saw something in her eyes, a glimmer of both fear and hope, as though she knew what he did not, that once he stepped further into this house, there would be no turning back. And so he stood there, the night pressing close, the silence waiting to be broken, knowing that the next breath he took might bind him to her story forever. The cowboy did not speak at first. He let the silence settle around them, heavy as the storm clouds rolling unseen over the plains. He could feel her eyes on him, watching as though waiting for him to make the wrong move. The way she held herself, shoulders stiff, hands folded tight against her chest, spoke of a woman who had endured too much in too short a time. It was not only grief that haunted her, but something that pressed down harder than sorrow ever could. He moved toward the table, slow and deliberate, setting his hat down on the worn wood. The lantern's glow caught the lines of his face, scars etched from a life on the trail, yet there was something steady in his gaze. He glanced at the rope again, coiled too neatly on the shelf, and the marks along the wooden post beside it. They looked like scratches, faint but unmistakable, as though someone had once struggled there. He did not speak of it, not yet. Some truths revealed themselves in time, and forcing them too soon could shatter whatever fragile trust he had. She busied herself with the pot on the stove, though her movements were restless, almost clumsy. The clatter of tin seemed louder than it should have been, as though the house magnified every sound. Finally, she said, "The trail's long. You'll need food and water." Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, like she was reminding herself to hold some distance. He nodded, accepting her words without argument. "I won't trouble you long," he replied. "Just till morning." She looked at him then, truly looked, her eyes holding his for a heartbeat before darting away. "Morning feels a long way off in this house," she whispered. The cowboy caught the weight of her meaning. He had heard stories in his travels of houses left behind after tragedies, places where folks swore they heard whispers at night or felt hands on their shoulders when no one stood near. He never put much stock in them, but standing here, with the air so heavy and her words carrying that tremor of truth, he felt something stir in his chest that wasn't easy to shake off. He sat, the chair creaking beneath him. "You've been here alone since your man passed?" he asked gently. Her lips pressed together before she answered. "The land doesn't forgive weakness. After he was gone, I did what I could." Neighbors helped for a time, but fear grows quick out here. They don't come anymore. She kept her back to him, staring into the pot though the food had long gone cold. I hear things. At night mostly. The kind of things you can't explain. The cowboy studied her in the flicker of lantern light. And you think it's something not of this world? She turned to face him, her eyes wide and dark, a fire burning behind them that spoke of sleepless nights and too many unanswered questions. I don't know what it is, but I know it isn't finished with me. Her words lingered in the air, heavier than the smoke curling from the chimney. He leaned back in his chair, the leather of his coat creaking. The room felt smaller with each breath, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. He thought of the scratches, the rope, the way her hands trembled without her meaning them to. This was no simple tale of grief. Something had held her, bound her in ways that went deeper than flesh. The cowboy was not a man given to superstition, but he trusted what he felt. And right now, he felt that if he rode away come sunrise, the weight of her silence would follow him down every mile of trail. He had stumbled onto something meant to remain hidden, but already it had begun to claim his attention. She poured him a tin cup of water, her hands brushing the rim just enough that he noticed the faint bruises along her wrist. Old, faded, but still there. She caught his glance and pulled her sleeve down quick. You should rest in the barn, she said firmly, trying to push him away with her words, though her eyes betrayed a different truth. A truth that begged him not to leave her alone in the house. He stood, taking the cup in hand but not drinking. The barn'll do, he said, though he knew sleep would be scarce under its roof. Before stepping out, he paused at the door, turning back to her. Lock this behind me, and if you hear anything, don't open it. She nodded, though the look on her face said she had heard too many noises already, and most of them hadn't waited for permission to come inside. The cowboy stepped into the night. The air was cold, the kind that cut through cloth and skin alike. The barn stood silent, its door sagging on rusted hinges. Inside, his horse shifted, uneasy, ears twitching at sounds the cowboy could not hear. He laid out his bedroll but kept his gun within arm's reach. Sleep came in restless patches, broken by the far-off wail of coyotes and the groan of wood bending in the wind out at one point. Near midnight, he woke to the sound of something moving in the dirt just outside. Slow steps, deliberate, circling the barn. His horse snorted, muscles tightening. The cowboy reached for his gun, holding his breath as the steps came closer, then faded into nothing. When he threw open the barn door, the yard lay empty, moonlight spreading across the farmhouse like a pale shroud. Yet in the upstairs window, he swore he saw her silhouette, standing still, staring out toward him. Morning came gray and hollow, with clouds low on the horizon. The cowboy found her already awake, sitting at the table, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She looked at him with that same heavy silence, as though words could not carry the weight of what pressed on her heart. He sat across from her, resting his hat on the table. There's something you ain't told me, he said quietly. She did not answer at first. Then, with a voice as thin as paper, she whispered, The night my husband died, it wasn't natural. He had enemies, men who wanted what was his. He fought them, but I think they left something behind. Not just fear. Something worse. The cowboy leaned forward. And you believe that's what's been binding you here? Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. I don't just believe it. I feel it. Like a rope I can't see, pulling tight around me. Some nights I can't breathe. Some nights I wake and I'm sure I hear his voice, but it isn't him. It's something using his memory to keep me tied. The cowboy sat back, his jaw tightening. He had known men who carried chains of guilt, who dreamed of the dead until they couldn't tell night from day. But what she described carried another kind of weight. He could not dismiss it as mere grief. Not after the footsteps, the scratches, the bruises she tried to hide. The day wore on slow, each hour dragging heavier than the last. He offered to help mend the fence, fetch water, anything to give her some ease, but she refused. It was as if the land itself no longer welcomed kindness, as though every act of help only deepened the burden she bore. By sundown, the sky burned crimson again, and the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The cowboy stood on the porch, watching the horizon darken, when he heard her behind him. "It comes stronger when night falls," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. He turned, meeting her eyes. "Then I'll stay inside tonight," he said, though he knew what that meant. Whatever haunted this house, whatever bound her so tightly, would not let him remain only a bystander. Her face softened for the first time, a flicker of hope breaking through the weariness. But it faded quick as the lantern inside flickered low, its flame sputtering like a warning. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles pale. The cowboy stepped past her into the house, the weight of night settling heavy on his shoulders. He did not yet know what he had chosen by staying, but he felt it in his bones that whatever stalked these walls had been waiting for him to. And as the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, the sound of unseen footsteps began again, this time not outside the barn but within the walls themselves, creeping closer, refusing to be ignored. The first bang came from the pantry door, a heavy thud as if a shoulder leaned hard into it. The cowboy turned toward the sound while the widow stiffened beside the stove, a kettle whining low. He raised a hand, asking her to stay put, and crossed the floor with a careful step. The pantry latch hung crooked. He lifted it, eased the door open, and stared into sacks of flour, jars of peaches, and a small square window that had no business being unlatched in winter. He shut it and slid the iron hook in place. When he faced her again, her eyes were wet but steady. "It tests the weak points," she said. "Like a man checking a fence," he nodded once. "Then we shore them up." They dragged a bench to brace the back door, pushed a trunk under the front latch, and set the lantern on the floor to cut the tall shadows that gathered when the flame sat high. When they finished, they stood in the middle of the room, breath slow, the house creaking as if it too exhaled. "Tell me about the men who came here," he said. She wrapped her shawl tight, then loosened it as if she disliked the feel around her throat. "They were not many. 3, maybe 4. I did not see them all. It happened fast. They wanted the deed to the north pasture where the spring runs. My husband refused. He thought right stood taller than a gun. He was wrong." Her voice did not break. That steadiness told him how often she had retold it in her head. The cowboy studied the room and imagined the scene. The table overturned, boots scuffing the floor, the rope on the shelf taken down not to tie a steer but to make a woman small and helpless. He pushed the picture away without letting it touch his face. "You know who they were," he said, not as a question. "I know one name," she answered. "Folks in town whisper it. Crowder." The cowboy had heard that name on trails where men spit to clean their mouths afterward. A gambler turned rustler turned something worse. Smart enough to hide his hand behind others, mean enough to make a message out of any mistake. "If he wanted the spring, he will try again," the cowboy said. "He already has," she replied, and tilted her chin toward the upstairs. The cowboy followed her gaze. The house shifted in a small shiver. "He sends men when the moon is thin," she said. "Sometimes they scratch at the window frame so I will look. Sometimes they rattle the doors to hear if I run. Sometimes I hear one of them call my name like we are old friends," she swallowed. "And sometimes it is not a man's voice at all." The wind lifted and the shutter on the east wall thumped twice, as if to show its agreement. The cowboy took a breath and let it out slow. "I need to walk the line," he said. "See where they come and go. I will go at first light. Then I will go with you," she answered. He almost argued, then saw the set of her jaw and did not. Part of the binding here was this land itself. If he walked it alone, he would learn the tracks. If she walked it, she might claim a piece of herself back. She brewed coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. He drank it without sugar and felt the night steady to a sharper edge. To keep her mind from the stairs and the sounds, he asked about the farm before Lust dug its trench. She told him about the spring when cattle came glossy to drink, about hay cut clean and stacked high, about an apple tree that ought not to thrive in this dry country yet did so anyway. Her voice warmed when she spoke of chores well done, wheels greased, tools set in order. He listened. A man learns a place by its labor more than by its stories. Near midnight the steps inside the walls faded. In their place came a softer rhythm, like breathing that did not belong to either of them. He stood and the sound stopped. He sat and it returned. The widow closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them. "It wants me to hear it," she said. "It wants me to think there is someone here already and that I have no say in the matter." "You do," he said. "You have every say." Before dawn smudged the windows with gray. He dozed in the chair and woke to the faint scrape of skates on ice far away. He realized it was only the branches of the cottonwood by the well rubbing in the wind. He cleaned his gun with slow hands, then put it away. Some fights were better without it if he could help it. When the light came honest, they stepped outside. The yard told the truth. The night had tried to hide. The snow in the ruts held a set of prints that began and ended in ways that made no sense. Some showed a heavy heel, some a lighter stride, and one path curved toward the window like a snake drawn by heat. The cowboy crouched and touched the mark. The edge was sharp. No drift had moved across it. "This was last night," he said. "2 men at least. Maybe 3. One waits. One watches." He lifted his gaze toward the scrub that ran north. They kept to the sage until late. "See the broken stems?" The widow nodded. Her face was pale but firm. "Crowder's men use that draw," she said. "The ground swallows sound." They followed the prints to the fence where a slat lay loose. Beyond it, the land tilted down to a dry wash. Hoof marks crowded the bed. The cowboy measured them with his eye and found 2 mustangs and a big, slow gelding with a stone in the left hind shoe. The stone left a small notch every 3rd step. He stood, thinking. A man who rides with a stone long enough for it to leave a story is either careless or cruel. Maybe both. He tracked the trail north until it cut over the ridge toward a stand of fir. From there, the view opened toward the road that led to town. He made a choice then that surprised him. "We will go to town," he said. The widow looked toward the farmhouse and then back at him. "Do we dare?" "We do not hide," he said. "We ask questions where Crowder thinks fear will hold our tongues." She hesitated, then nodded. They saddled the horse. He offered the reins to her, but she shook her head. "I will walk beside," she said. "My feet know this road." On the way, the land did what the land always does. It carried the past forward. The old American trail ran straight as a plumb line. A hawk circled over the far field. The sun pressed through thin clouds and threw long beams over snow that had started to crust. The cowboy kept his eyes moving. Twice he saw riders on distant ridges. They did not draw close. Town sat small in the bowl of the valley, a place of clabbered, smoke, and cold iron. They tied the horse outside the mercantile and stepped in. The shopkeeper looked up and froze, then pasted on a smile that slipped at the corners. "Morning," he said, voice too bright. "What brings you down from the farm?" The widow did not waste words. "We need salt and information," she said. "One I will pay for. The other, I hope, is still free." The shopkeeper's gaze flicked to the cowboy and back. "What sort of information?" "The sort that keeps folks alive," the cowboy answered. He leaned on the counter like a man in no hurry, though every part of him was ready to move. "You have heard the name Crowder." I want the names of the men who ride under him here." The shopkeeper's throat worked. He lifted a sack from a shelf, set it down, lifted it again, then set it in a different place. "A man in my position hears many names," he said, "and sometimes forgetting them is the price of doing business." The widow stepped close, her voice low and even. "My husband paid for forgetting with his life," she said. "I am done paying." Silence spread. A clock on the wall ticked. The shopkeeper glanced toward the door behind him where a curtain hung over a back office. When he spoke again, the words came out flat. "The big one with the stone in his shoe is called Wade. He drinks 2 doors down and breaks glasses when folk do not stand back fast enough. The one who watches is called Deke. He does not talk unless someone stronger is behind him." Crowder comes in quiet with both eyes smiling. "That is how you know he is thinking something loud." The cowboy nodded once. "Thank you." He paid for the salt and a few other supplies, then asked for a slip of paper and wrote the names in a neat hand. He folded it and tucked it in his coat dot as they left the shop. A man stepped from the saloon with a slow grin that did not lift his eyes. He wore a coat too fine for his manners and boots made for swagger. The left one clicked in a strange rhythm. The widow's hands tightened on her shawl. The cowboy marked the notch in the step and knew him at once. Wade took a long look at the widow and then at the cowboy, measuring both with the care of a carpenter who means to split a board and leave a clean edge. "Morning," he drawled. "You two look like a prayer and a gun walked in together." "Morning," the cowboy said. "You look like a man who left something near a farmhouse last night." A small hush fell on the street. Wade's grin widened, but his eyes thinned. "I leave a lot of things around this valley. Can't keep track." He tapped his boot on the plank. Click, click, pause. "Tell the widow the spring belongs to folks who know how to use water well. She owns the deed." The cowboy said. Wade shrugged. "Paper burns." The cowboy saw 3 men in the saloon door behind Wade. One held a glass. One rested a hand near his vest. The third stared at the widow with a look that made the cowboy's jaw set hard. He shifted a half step to block that line of sight. Wade saw the move and chuckled. "You standing guard, trail man? Careful. The wind out here cuts deep." "Not as deep as a man with a stone in his shoe," the cowboy said. "Must hurt to walk with that every step." For the first time, Wade's face altered. "Not much, just a twitch near his eye." "I like the way it sounds," he said. "Then keep it," the cowboy replied. "It will be useful when folks come looking." Wade lifted his glass in a tiny toast that held no goodwill. "See you out there," he said, and turned away. They did not rush. Rushing would be fear, and fear would taste good in men like that. The widow and the cowboy walked toward the horse. A thin woman with a basket gave the widow a small nod, almost hidden by the bonnet. A boy sweeping steps paused and whispered, "Watch the ridge at dusk." The cowboy filed both in his head. They left town by the south road to throw off any tail and cut back toward the farm along a fence line hidden by brush. They spoke little. Each step felt like a drumbeat. At the crest of the last hill, the farmhouse looked small and lonely, a box set down by a giant hand and forgotten. Smoke from the chimney climbed straight up. No wind, a bad sign. On still days, sound carries farther. The yard told fresh stories. The trunk they had pushed under the latch was moved a thumb's width from its mark, like a finger had tested it and then set it back. The pantry window hook had a new shine where a blade had scraped it. The rope on the shelf remained in its coil but sat on the opposite side from where the cowboy had seen it. Whatever pressed them had not needed to break in. It preferred to unsettle with proof that they had been watched. He set the widow to boiling water and cutting strips of cloth. A chore with a purpose, even if the purpose stayed unspoken. He went upstairs to the room where her husband once slept and opened a trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside lay papers tied with twine. He untied them and read the top page. A survey map of the north pasture. A pencil mark traced a line from the spring to a second smaller pool hidden inside a ring of rock. The note beside it read, in a square hand, second source. Deeper, cold. The cowboy felt his heartbeat change. Crowder did not only want water for cattle. He wanted control of a second well no one else knew about. With drought always a threat, that would make him a king. He heard a floorboard shift and turned. The widow stood in the doorway, her face alert. "I never saw that," she said. "Your husband kept it quiet," the cowboy said. He wanted to be sure before he told anyone. She stepped in and touched the paper like it might burn her. "He told me once in the last week that he felt a hand on his shoulder at night. He said it was worry. I did not know it was this." Crowder knew, the cowboy said. Or guessed. That is why he does not stop. If he gets this spring and the deeper one, he owns half the valley by summer. The wind rose at last and the house seemed to lean into it. The widow folded the paper along the old crease and handed it to him. "What do we do?" "We make it harder," he said. "Hide our proof. Move in ways they do not expect. And we make friends." He told her his plan in short lines. He would ride to the old mining road where a small mission stood empty except for a caretaker with a clear mind and a long memory. The caretaker, a former scout everyone called brother, knew the folds of this land better than any man living. If anyone understood a second source of water, it would be him. The widow would go to the nearest neighbor who still had the courage to be seen with her, a stubborn ranch woman with a scar along her cheek and a shotgun above the door. Together they would send a message to the preacher who kept the town ledgers. Deeds had a way of growing legs, and the preacher could hold them if needed. They set off at different times so as not to draw a single trail. The widow went first, head covered, steps brisk. The cowboy waited, then rode toward the mission at a trot that looked lazy but 8 miles. The sky lowered as he climbed into the hills. Snow began as a sift, then thickened into hard grains that stung his face. By mid-afternoon he reached the mission. The bell rope hung still. He dismounted and led the horse into the lee of a wall. A man stepped from the doorway, tall and lean, with a coat patched at the elbows and eyes that saw past the first layer of anything. "Brother," the cowboy said. "Trailman," brother answered, and smiled in a way that put heat back in the day. "I wondered when the wind would bring you." They spoke inside over a stove that clanked and rattled. The cowboy laid out the map and the names. Brother traced the pencil line with a scarred finger and nodded slow. "Your second source is real," he said. "I found it as a boy, then forgot the path until now. It does not run every season, but when it runs it is clean and deep. Whoever controls it during a dry spell will decide who eats." The stove snapped as sap burned inside an old knot. Brother's eyes went narrow. "Crowder will set men at the ridge and in the draws. He will not risk his own skin until the last moment. That is his way. I need to walk the old channel before he does," the cowboy said. "You will," brother replied, then lifted his head like a wolf catching a scent on wind. "But not today." A shadow crossed the window. 2 riders slid into view at the edge of the yard, horses steaming, coats dark with wet snow. One leaned forward and peered toward the mission door as if he smelled the coffee. The other tilted his head to listen. The cowboy felt the weight of a stare even through the wall. He slid the map under the stove ash and stood without a sound. Brother smiled again, this time with teeth. "Guests," he said. "Let us be polite." Back at the farm, the widow stood in the doorway of the neighbor's house, clutching a package wrapped in brown paper. The ranch woman had agreed to hold the deed and the survey until this storm passed and the preacher could make a clean copy. As the widow stepped off the porch, she heard hoofbeats where there should have been none and looked up to see a rider. watching from the cottonwoods at the edge of the property. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low. Even at distance she knew the posture. Deke, the watcher. He touched a finger to his hat brim in a cold greeting. Then he turned his horse and moved away, slow as a man walking along a riverbed, testing each stone. The widow felt something cold slide through her courage, but she gripped the package tighter and started back toward her home, knowing that every step drew attention. The ridge to the north darkened with the weather. The valley held a hush that meant more than snow. Somewhere between her and the house, a coyote cried once, short and sharp, a signal rather than a song. She walked faster, heart pounding, breath showing in clouds. Halfway to the yard she saw it. A small piece of cloth hung on the fence post by the gate, tied in a careful knot. It was her own handkerchief, the one she had lost last week when she fetched wood in a hurry. Someone had taken it and returned it as a sign. The knot was tight and neat, a mirror of the coil of rope on her shelf. The message burned clear. You are bound to this place. We hold the ties. She looked up at the house that had once held her life and now held her struggle, and for a long moment she did not move. Then she lifted the handkerchief, untied the knot with slow patience, folded the cloth, and slipped it into her pocket. No, she said under her breath. You do not claim me? She walked through the gate without looking left or right, though she felt eyes on her from both sides. Inside the house, she set the package under a loose floorboard and let the board drop with a soft thud. The sound steadied her. The house that once trapped her could become a place where she laid her own plans. She lit the lantern and stood still to let the flame settle. The wind rose and the shutters banged again, 3 times in a row, then stopped as if a hand pressed them quiet. Out at the mission, Brother opened the door for the riders and greeted them with the warmth of a winter hearth. The men stepped inside with dripping coats and greedy eyes. One looked around like a man guessing the shape of a room by its echoes. The other held his hands near the stove and watched the cowboy from the edge of his vision. Brother poured coffee and asked about their trail. They said little. The cowboy said less. Outside, the snow thickened until the world shrank to the size of the room and, whatever was set to happen inside it, night slid down fast and heavy. The riders did not leave. Brother's smile did not falter, but his hands moved with the efficiency of a man who has stood on tight edges before. The cowboy felt the same calm gather in him, that narrow clarity a trail man finds when every sound matters. He thought of the widow walking back under a sky that held more eyes than stars. He thought of Wade and Deke and the man whose eyes smiled when his thoughts turned cruel. He thought of water running under rock where no one could see it, and of rope coiled on a shelf waiting for a hand. He did not yet know how the night would demand its price. He only knew it had come to collect. The riders stayed through the storm as if they had always meant to. They spoke little, only short words about the weather, about horses, about nothing that carried weight. Their eyes did the real talking, shifting between the cowboy and Brother, lingering on the stove where ash hid the survey map. The cowboy sat with his back to the wall and his hand near his belt, though the gun stayed holstered. Brother kept the coffee pouring, his smile steady, but his eyes flicked to the window each time the wind shifted. He knew as well as the cowboy that others might be out there, waiting for a signal. When the night thickened into a silence that made even the stove sound loud, one of the men rose and walked to the door. He opened it just wide enough to look out. Snow fell in hard flakes, blanketing tracks faster than they could form. He stood there too long, as if listening for something beneath the wind. Then he closed it again, slower than before, and returned to his chair. The cowboy watched his shoulders, the way tension rode them, and thought of wolves who sniffed the air before striking. Back at the farmhouse, the widow moved from window to window, lantern low, eyes sharp. She had the sense of being circled, the way cattle bunch when coyotes test the herd. She pulled a loose board in the floor and checked the package, then pressed it back into place. She brewed coffee, though she could not drink, filling the room with a bitter scent that made the house feel less empty. Outside, the snow softened every sound until the world seemed to hold its breath. When she finally lay down, she left the lamp burning, unwilling to give darkness all the corners. The cowboy did not sleep at the mission. Neither did the riders. They shifted in their chairs, whispered once or twice, and let silence take over again. Brother hummed a hymn under his breath and polished the edge of a wooden spoon. The air held more than smoke. It held waiting. The cowboy could almost feel Crowder's hand in it, guiding his men to sit like shadows until the right hour came. At dawn, the riders stood. One tipped his hat in mock respect, the other gave no sign at all. They mounted and rode off through the thinning storm, their tracks swallowed as soon as they cut them. The cowboy stepped outside after, scanning the ridge. He saw nothing but knew they had not gone far. He turned back to Brother, who handed him a strip of dried meat and a quiet nod. "Crowder draws them in close," Brother said. "He will want you to taste the trap before it shuts." The cowboy tied the meat in his saddlebag and mounted. "Then let's be ready when it does." He rode hard for the farmhouse, cutting across the lower wash to avoid leaving a straight trail. When he crested the last hill, he saw smoke rising steady from the chimney. Relief struck first, then caution. Smoke could be comfort, or it could be signal. He slowed, eyes searching the yard. The trunk under the front latch was in place, but the pantry shutter moved against the wind in a rhythm too even to be chance. He slipped from the saddle and led the horse behind the shed. The widow opened the door before he knocked, her eyes sharp, her face pale but unbroken. "They were here," she said. "Not inside, not yet. They left their mark." He followed her to the kitchen where the rope lay across the table, uncoiled, tied in a single loop, placed neat as a gift. He touched it with one finger and set it back down. The widow's jaw tightened. "They want me afraid," she said. "You're not," he answered. "No," she said, though her voice carried both steel and tremor. He told her about the mission, about the riders, about Brother's warning. She told him about the man watching from the cottonwoods and the handkerchief tied on her gate. They shared the pieces until a picture formed, one that showed Crowder pressing from every side, waiting for the moment to close in. The cowboy spread the survey map on the table and pointed to the second spring. "This is what he wants," he said. "As long as we hold this, we have something he cannot risk losing." The widow stared at the pencil line and then at him. "And when he comes for it, then we make him pay to touch it," the cowboy said. Through the day they set to work. They moved sacks of grain against weak spots in the wall, barred the windows with boards pulled from the shed, stacked wood high for fire and for barricade. The widow cut strips of cloth for bandages. The cowboy sharpened a short axe and set buckets near the stove for water. They spoke little while they worked, the silence not empty but filled with shared resolve. By sundown, the farmhouse looked less like a home and more like a stronghold. The sun dropped, and with it came the hush before something breaks. The widow lit a lantern and set it low in the front window, the flame steady, a signal to anyone watching that the house was not empty and not surrendering. The cowboy sat near the door, gun within reach, eyes on the yard. He listened. He counted the beats between the gusts of wind. He waited. The first sound was faint, a single knock against the fence post. Then another and another, slow and deliberate. The widow froze, listening. The cowboy rose, stepped to the window, and peered out. A shape stood at the gate, still as a carving. He knew it was Deke even before the man lifted his hand in that slow salute. Behind him the darkness shifted, and more figures took shape. Wade among them, broad shoulders marked by the tilt of his coat. The cowboy scanned for Crowder but saw only shadows that might hide him. "There, here," he said. The widow came to stand beside him, her face pale but steady. "Then it begins." The knock at the fence stopped. Silence spread, deep and heavy, as if the earth itself leaned in to listen. Then came a voice, smooth and clear, carrying through the cold night. A voice that smiled even when unseen. "Evening," it said. "I've come for what is mine." The widow's hand tightened on the shawl at her throat. The cowboy felt the hair rise at his neck. Crowder had finally stepped close enough to be heard. The rope on the table seemed to wait. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. The night thickened around the farmhouse, pressing close. The cowboy glanced at the widow, then back at the dark yard filled with shadows. Every beat of his heart told him the same thing. The storm had only been the prelude. The real fight was about to break, and neither side meant to leave without blood or surrender. The silence held, stretching like a drawn bow, and in that stillness every breath, every flicker of flame, every whisper of wind carried the weight of what was coming. The cowboy stood with his back against the heavy door, the widow close beside him, as Crowder's voice rolled across the yard. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the shadows stirred and spread, closing in from the fence line. The cowboy's hand settled on the butt of his gun, but he did not draw. He had learned long ago that the first shot must mean something, and this was not the moment. Crowder called again, smoother now, coaxing like a man bidding on cattle. "No need for hurt. Bring me the paper and the spring is safe. You'll sleep easier when it's settled." His words reached inside the walls, heavy with false kindness. The widow lifted her chin, her breath sharp. She stepped forward, closer to the window where the lantern glow lit her face, and answered loud enough for all to hear. "This land is not yours, and no paper will make it so. My husband worked it, and I'll keep it. Go back to your ranch if you want to sleep easy." The silence that followed told the cowboy all he needed. Crowder had not expected her to speak with such fire. He had counted on fear, on weariness, on surrender. Instead, her voice cut across the cold like a whip. The shadows shifted uneasily, but Crowder only laughed, a short, hard sound. "Then we do it the harder way," he said. A gun fired from the dark, the crack splitting the night. The bullet slammed into the wood of the door, sending splinters flying. The cowboy pulled the widow back, shoving her behind the stove, and returned fire through the window. The sharp bark of his revolver echoed against the hills, answered by more shots from the yard. Glass shattered, wood split, smoke thickened in the room. The fight had begun. The cowboy moved quick, firing, ducking, loading again. He knew Crowder's men wanted him to waste bullets, to show his hand, but he gave them only measured shots, each one meant to keep them low. The widow brought buckets of water, dousing sparks when bullets caught on the walls. Her hand shook, but she never faltered. She spoke to him between volleys, steady words that kept him grounded. "You hold them. I'll keep the house alive." Then came the sound of hooves thundering down the ridge. For a heartbeat, the cowboy thought more of Crowder's men had come, but then he saw lanterns swinging and heard Brother's voice calling. A handful of townsfolk, ranch hands, and even the neighbor woman had ridden through the storm to stand with them. The gunfire turned, confusion breaking the rhythm of the attack. Crowder's men scattered to meet the new riders, and the balance shifted. Crowder himself finally stepped into the open. His hat tilted low, his coat long, his stance calm even in the chaos. He raised his rifle, not at the riders but straight at the farmhouse window. The cowboy saw him, felt the moment stretch, and fired. The shot struck true, knocking Crowder's rifle from his hands. For the first time, the man stumbled, not from a wound but from shock. His eyes lifted, meeting the cowboy's through the smoke. For once, his smile was gone. The fight dragged until the sky lightened with dawn. One by one, Crowder's men broke off, riding hard back into the hills. Those still standing saw their leader beaten in spirit, his power broken. When Wade finally dropped his gun and walked away without looking back, the others followed. Crowder was left alone near the gate, his hands empty, his words gone. He turned slowly, his coat dragging in the snow, and walked into the trees. The land did not claim him, but it no longer obeyed him either. When the last echo faded, the yard lay quiet. Smoke curled from the chimney, glass crunched beneath boots, and the farmhouse still stood. The widow stepped to the door, her shoulders heavy yet unbowed. She looked at the cowboy, her voice low but clear. "It is finished." Brother and the townsfolk helped patch the walls, carried the wounded, and laid rest to those who had fallen. The widow thanked each of them, her words plain but strong. She offered food, though her stores were thin, and no one left until the sun was high. When they rode away, the land felt different, lighter, as if the weight that had pressed on it for so long had been lifted. The cowboy and the widow stood in the yard once the last rider was gone. The snow was melting under the weak sun, trickling down toward the spring Crowder had wanted so badly. The cowboy looked at the water and then at her. "You held it," he said. "Not me, you." Her eyes met his, tired but alive. "We held it," she said. In the days that followed, the house was mended. New glass filled the windows, boards were sanded smooth, and the rope left by Crowder's men was burned in the stove until nothing remained but ash. The widow worked the land again, her hand steady on the plow, her voice steady at night when she told the story to those who asked. She spoke of courage, of fear, of standing when it would have been easier to give way. The cowboy stayed long enough to see the farm whole again. He helped mend fences, cut wood, and drive the cattle that had scattered. He sat at the table each night, quiet while the widow's words filled the room. Yet he knew the trail would call him again. Men like him did not belong in one place forever. The road always asked for another step. When the time came, he saddled his horse before dawn. The widow met him at the gate, shawl tight against the morning chill. She did not ask him to stay. She only placed her hand on his arm and said, "Go with peace. You gave back more than you took." He tipped his hat, the brim shadowing his eyes, and rode toward the horizon. The farmhouse grew smaller behind him, but the memory of it stayed. The woman who had faced Crowder and his men, the land that had refused to yield, the spring that had run free through every trial. As the hills opened before him, the cowboy thought of all he had seen. How fear could chain, but courage could break those chains. How loss could hollow a soul, but hope could fill it again. How even a place weighed down by grief could rise when its people stood tall. The land kept its secrets, but one truth had been carved clear as stone. What is claimed by greed will fade. What is held with heart will endure. The cowboy rode on, the sky wide above, the road endless ahead. Behind him lay the farm, the widow, and the spring that had outlasted storm and fire. Before him lay whatever waited, but he carried the lesson forward, that even in the loneliest places, even when the night feels endless, there is strength in standing, and light enough for the next step. And so the story closed, not with a shout, but with the steady rhythm of hoofbeats carrying him toward the horizon, leaving behind a farmhouse where life had been restored, and a widow who had found her ground once more. The land was safe, the spring still flowing, and the memory of the fight became a tale told in quiet voices by firelight, reminding all who listen that courage and hope can hold against even the darkest night. Top of form, bottom of form.